Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mental Health TV. We're really pleased to have you with us again tonight. I've got two amazing colleagues of mine with me tonight. We're going to be talking about mental health social work. But before we do that, and obviously we want loads and loads of questions and people asking our fantastic guests all about social work. So I'll come over to Dave and he can tell you how you can join in.
Hi, everyone. You may notice that my voice is a bit husky tonight. I've been a bit poorly over the last few days, so hopefully it will maintain this level of noise. And won't cut out. It's great for you thank you for joining us tonight and our excellent guests. As always, if you'd like to get involved in the conversation, you've got a couple of options. The first one is on the Facebook Live chat. If you go to the MHNA Facebook Live page and put any questions or comments in, we'll try and feed through as many as possible. The other option that you've got is on Twitter. And all you need to do is include the hashtag MHTV. We'll be able to see the tweets and then hopefully we'll be able to bring those into the conversation again. Without further ado, back over to you, Nicky.
Okay, so let's go to our first guest, Cherie. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. I'm Cherie Carlton. I'm a senior lecturer at Middlesex University on a postgraduate social work qualifying programme called Think Ahead. I'm a social worker, obviously, by discipline, and I have approximately 20-something years experience of working in social work practice, both in the UK and in Australia, both in adult and children's social work.
Fantastic. Ed, how about you? Have you frozen, Ed?
Hi, everybody. My name's... Bye. Tell me when I've stopped freezing.
You've stopped freezing.
See you all. So, okay, good. Oh, well, thank you. Perfect. Right, so my name's Ed Carter. I'm a senior lecturer at Middlesex University, and I am a qualified social worker. And I worked for a number of years in adult learning disability services and also in mental health services, and was a qualified approved mental health professional. Well, actually, I was an approved social worker, as it was back in those days. And I think I just about did the conversion to an AMP before I moved from practice into higher education, where I've taught predominantly around adult social care, social work, obviously with a focus on learning disability and mental health at times. And in my current role, I'm the Director of Programmes for Think Ahead, which is a national mental health social work qualifying programme. So people on that programme qualify as social workers and register with Social Work England. But the focus, there's a kind of a lens, I suppose, that we put through the training, which is around mental health. And the students have placements in mental health settings as part of that. And that's a programme we run in partnership with a charity called Think Ahead, who have run the programme for a number of years now. And I also have responsibility for overseeing continued professional development in the social work cluster, so CPD, practice education, best interest assessment, improved mental health professional training, and those sort of things.
You're busy then. I guess. So just before we even get started, perhaps it'd be really useful just to say exactly what does the social worker do? What's the function of a social worker? What makes them unique in their profession? That'd be really helpful.
And Cherie, maybe if you, I'm going to throw this to you and throw you under the bus. If you give an overview, and then I'll say a bit about, particularly in how it works in mental health settings. So you're happy to kind of do an overview of what an actual social worker is. Yeah.
A social worker works in a range of different kind of practice areas, from children and families to adult services across the spectrum. We're driven by a rights-based perspective, social justice, looking at promoting rights, human rights particularly, collaborating with service users through relationship-based practice, supporting people to make the changes in their lives that they might need to improve those, working within policy and legal frameworks to promote rights and well-being.
Yes. And I think probably there's a public perception of social work, I think, which is really focused around, well, I guess if you were to ask a random person on the street, it'd almost certainly be around taking children into care, probably in error. And I guess that there's always that kind of balance in social work between public protection roles, so safeguarding children and vulnerable adults, but also around that promoting rights and enabling people. And so the two sides of the coin really are that public protection element, but the other side is around identifying people's needs, identifying services to meet them and to enable people to be independent and autonomous in their choices. And the vast majority of people that come into contact with a social worker outside of a professional capacity, it will be in the context of them having a social care need of some description, which they need support with. And the social worker will be the person who kind of helps them to identify what that support might be and then helps them to access it. I think social work is, we have this generic profession. So when people qualify as a social worker, they can work in any field. So they can work in mental health, learning disability, physical disability, children in need, fostering and adoption, child protection. And the qualification gives people the skills and knowledge and values to work across those. That said, I think there is a bit of a separation within the profession, that, you know, children's services are largely regulated by Ofsted, and whereas adult services are generally regulated by the CQC. There are kind of specialist roles that are more aligned to adult services, so the approved mental health professional role, the best interest assessor role, and there's roles that are more aligned to sort of children and families work. And I guess sort of those you might see that as the two main pathways. And people do cross over across them, but not that often, I would actually say. I think once people set off down one pathway, once they're established in their career, they probably kind of stay in there. I think mental health is probably a slight outlier in that, in terms of how social workers operate, because they are operating in a health setting, often, not exclusively, but often operating in a health setting, which is kind of different again from children and families work and other areas of adult social care, which tend to be working for local authorities. So some of the functions change a little bit with that. And I think one thing that we might come on to talk about today is that there is a lot of discussion around the identity of social work within mental health settings, and the fact that there are a lot of shared tasks in that arena with other professionals, such as occupational therapists and community mental health nurses, and community learning disability nurses, and various other professions, which probably is less the case in other areas where social workers practice. So if you're working in an older person's service and more learning disabilities, as I was, mostly you're going to have your social work team around you, and you're doing your social work bit and other people are doing their bit. But in adult mental health, there's much more overlap and blurring of the roles often, and I think that comes from the idea of the care coordinator. And when that was introduced, it was introduced as a role that a number of professions could sit in and occupy. And certainly for a long time, and I think still to some degree, it's the predominant model and role within community mental health settings. And the way I was kind of, the thing that kind of brings it home to me is, I suppose, if I was a service user in mental health services and somebody said to me, what profession is your care coordinator? They would probably say, it's a care coordinator. They may well not know that the person's a social worker or an OT or a nurse. They don't see that kind of professional identity in the same way as we do in other services.
We always kind of valued that, though, about kind of community care, in that it wasn't about you, it was about the person who you were supporting. And you tended to get, if someone had a lot of medical needs, they would probably get someone who could do medication. If they had a lot of social needs, they'd probably get directed towards a social worker. And I kind of like that model. You know, I know that it does lead to a bit of jumbling around, but it feels like services should be here for the individual and not us telling people what we feel like looking after today. That's really different. Did you want to add to that, Cherie? Because I have a question for you if you didn't.
Yeah, no, I actually did. I was thinking about saying that people don't often kind of move between areas, and I'm one of those very few people who have worked both in adults and children's services. And I guess one of the things that I've found from practice is, that those experiences of working in children's services, based on the kind of knowledge and skills, I guess, of social work practice, the kind of life course theories, the psychological and social perspectives, start to understand the experiences of adults through the eyes of children, and equally thinking about the needs of parents, and understanding the needs and difficulties of parents in a different way it's been really helpful, having worked in children's services and adult services, to be able to kind of cross that divide. So I think that there's lots of benefits to that. And fundamentally, the knowledge and skills remains the same. Those are transferable skills in social work, and transferable knowledge. And I guess the practice principles remain the same in terms of, promoting rights, safeguarding, whether that's in adults or children's context, and looking at least restrictive kind of interventions, and kind of intervening only where it's necessary to do so.
One question that I've never asked, but I'm actually curious for both of you, is why did you become social workers? What was it? When did you know? How did you end up deciding to go down that route? Unless it's personal, of course, but perhaps we don't tell me. Just interested.
I was going to be a vet, I think, and then this is when I was like 9 years old. I'm not quite sure how I fell into it. I do know that I'd wanted to be a social worker since sort of the age of 11 or 12, and I had no personal kind of contact with social. A lot of people go into social work because they've either been through the care system, or they've had a relative who has, or that some relative who's needed social care in some way, and that's kind of how it's come on the radar, I think. But it was just, I think it was through kind of volunteering after school groups, and then meeting somebody who was a social worker and finding her very inspiring. And started to work in learning disability services, is initially sort of volunteering again when I was a kid, working in sort of play schemes and summer schemes, and then going into residential care when I was old enough to actually be paid to work there. And I get that's the other route I think a lot of people go into social work via, is kind of social care setting. So it's kind of, there's kind of a real ceiling around social care, particularly for adults. If you're working in a care home or something like that, there's no really career pathway around that, unless you're going to go into some sort of social enterprise and open up a string of care homes yourself. So it kind of felt like if you wanted a career in that broad area, then social work was the way to go with it.
What are you, Cherie?
Mine's quite similar in some ways, and very
vet as well.
I didn't want to be a vet or anything caring when I was young. I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought that was quite an ambitious, cool thing to do. But I volunteered with a voluntary service working with Irish traveller children in a transient traveller site, providing kind of preschool activity. And I really enjoyed the work. I found that I was kind of good at working with people with that have been disadvantaged structurally and otherwise. And I guess that kind of had some traction. And I pursued a social sciences degree. I think was my first degree with dips were attached. And that was the beginning of the end. Here I am.
I was all signed up to be a history teacher, so what a different world we nearly could have had. So thinking about the specialties, or going back to what Ed was saying about how they overlap and how they're distinct, I wondered if there's anything you guys wanted to add to that, or perhaps we could check and see if Dave's got any questions for us, if that's not the case. Did you guys want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I would. I think so. There's kind of the program we work on now, the mental health program, is born from some discussion and debate within the social work profession around social work and mental health settings. There's been kind of discussion around the idea that what makes social work unique as a profession had been lost a little bit in mental health services, in a kind of becoming more of a homogenized role, and actually that mental health services are predominantly led from a health perspective, and that's, obviously there's a lot of value in that knowledge base and that understanding, but that the kind of the social work uniqueness was getting squeezed, and actually the assets that they could bring to that area of work weren't being fully realised as a result of that. And so Ruth Allen, I can't remember when her report was now, I think it was around 2015, and more recently Mark Trewin has produced a report for Department of Health and Social Care that was published last autumn, which is kind of identifying this need to kind of really bolster the social work identity, and particularly looking at kind of the use of social interventions and promoting them in mental health settings. And I know, Nicky, in the department we work in, obviously, we have a lot of people working, a lot of colleagues from mental health services, as well as from social works within mental health nursing and other mental health roles. And so we're very aware that this isn't something that's alien to other professionals. And I think sometimes there is that perception that kind of social workers are based around the social model of health and impairment, and whereas medical professions are just based around giving medication and therapy. And obviously, I think that doesn't reflect the reality at all around how people want to practice. And a lot of sort of nursing colleagues and things are very kind of aware of these things. But I think the culture coming from kind of a health-led profession still doesn't kind of enable people working in their services to really promote kind of social interventions as a way of supporting service users and patients. I think there is still a very strong focus around kind of minimising hospital admissions, frankly, and minimising deaths. And that's absolutely as it should be. I mean, that's our number one priority. But I don't think mental health services need to be stopping there. And actually, I think hopefully with kind of a higher status or a higher visibility of social work roles within mental health services might help to kind of stimulate sort of more innovation around the use of social interventions and sort of cross-pollinate within that profession.
I love that. Sorry. I'm even going to gloss over the fact you described nurses as being part of the medical profession. Letting that go. Obviously, I've tagged it. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I was just thinking, Nicky, listening to Ed talk about the role of social work and the social work identity really being kind of, I guess, reinforced by more contemporary discussions about social determinants of mental health. Kind of really kind of wanting to engage with social policy and the kind of social around poverty and discrimination and other factors that have quite a significant influence on mental health and well-being. And I think we're in a good position to kind of bring some of that knowledge and skills forward to do that.
Yeah, I think so too. And for me, I have to say, I really I value so much working with social work colleagues because of the status of mental health nursing. So I think one of the issues is that, with nursing as a body can be quite biomedical and can absolutely live within that framework. But mental health nursing has always been a bit on the side, and there's, I think, a lot of people that came up through the kind of recovery model, through kind of looking at contrarian type stuff, looking at, the tidal model with a real expectation of social justice really embedded in mental health nursing. And having social workers in a team really just give you a couple of people on your side when you're arguing from that type of, because you can count on them because you know what they're going to think. So you can actually start to actually build a better care for somebody because you're looking at things in a genuinely holistic way. And everybody's, as Ed said, all the different sides of those arguments have got something to offer. And there are people who fall to across the spectrum, don't they? But I think when decisions are purely financial, that's when things start to get complicated. And you see it with things like the Mental Health Act, particularly with things like CTOs. I mean, do you remember when community treatment orders came in, they're like, there'll be like 5 people on this. And then like 5 people every second put on it. And there was a lot to be used, instead of it being used for therapeutic purposes, it can be used for bed clearance. And then it gets really complicated.
I think that was, people looked at the way guardianship has been used under the Mental Health Act, or not used hardly at all, and probably assumed that would be the same for CTOs. But yeah, what people didn't tweak was that you could potentially save a lot of money, or at least empty a lot of beds. And actually, what's I suppose, I know that we're not necessarily here to talk about the Mental Health Act, but the plus side of that, though, Nicky, I think, is that it maybe it's reduced kind of the misuse of Section 7 leave, which I certainly, when I was in practice, I knew patients who were on leave for over a year, it's just because people didn't want to bite the bullet and discharge them, because they sort of had anxieties and wanted to be able to say, well, they were never discharged, they were still an inpatient. So hopefully, maybe it's minimised the misuse of that section, and at least it's a slightly more framework around CTOs. But at the same time, I don't really think they were that well thought through.
I think we should swap over to Dave for a second and get some questions. I can see some come through on Facebook Live.
Yeah, we've got a few on Facebook Live, Nicky. The first one that I wanted to highlight was from Adrian, and it's focused to both of you. What are the current future challenges for social workers, and has COVID made the time more difficult?
Okay, thanks. And that's really interesting. I think in terms of, was it the current challenges or the current kind of focuses in social work? I think.
Yeah, I think a bit both really, but yeah.
But so the trends around in social work are the pressures are financial based fundamentally, and I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who's worked exclusively in adult services, but adult social care budgets were horrifically squeezed. That I would just argue dangerously squeezed before COVID.
Yeah.
And I don't think COVID has helped at all with that, for obvious reasons. And so until that gets resolved, I think that there's, those services are really at risk. And I think social workers are very, very constrained in terms of the extent to which they can do what they really want to do, which is actually to improve the quality of people's lives. Whereas at the moment, it feels to be more that they're just about sort of life and limb type services, really. And although the new legislation, the Care Act, is very much focused around these, it's not that new now, but it's very focused around this concept of well-being. Actually, that feels like sort of slightly lame rhetoric, I suppose, because there just isn't the resources there and to provide that to people. And so the kind of things like personalisation agenda, which is a whole other kind of area, but about this idea of promoting choice and independence, putting service users at the centre of the process, giving them the control over how their social care budgets are spent, giving them the choice over the services that they use. Those things are great, but actually, if you're giving them control over a care budget which is far too small and giving them a choice of far too few resources to choose from, then it's not actually addressing the problem. And I think maybe it's sort of a hangover of those neoliberal ideas that actually, will give you them a bit of the money and then you can sort out your own problems. It's a failed experiment, but it needs a kind of significant injection of resources to resolve those issues.
And I think in terms of practice issues, obviously COVID's raised inequities and inequalities quite substantially across the board. So demand on service provision is increased. along with that, but also, the COVID Act legislations has had impact on practice provision, perhaps, not the requirements for visiting and other things, statutory duties there's been variation to those in that context. So kind of undertaking the task is definitely much more limited, and having to think about kind of being more inventive about how we go about engaging in that relationship with service users and their families to address some of those difficulties is significant.
Just to sound like a slightly more optimistic tone, though, also, I think one thing that's happened in terms of COVID is it has massively raised public awareness of adult social care needs. I know that kind of applications for social work programs, undergraduate and postgraduate programs, is really up. So that suggests that people have a real growing awareness of the existence of social work as a profession and the usefulness of it.
There's a massive recession, Ed.
And also people know they're probably going to get a job as a result of doing training.
Putting that out there.
But yeah, I just think that there's definitely that it's now on the public agenda, whereas before, obviously, NHS funding is also something which is hugely been looked at. But in reality, it's a slightly artificial separation of the two. And I think, if we could turn back time 80 years, I think what would have been ideal is if we hadn't separated social care out from healthcare when we created the welfare state, and actually, the two are so symbiotic that pressures and social care inevitably lead to greater pressures on health services. Kind of that concept of something which is essential for people's lives, being free at the point of delivery, should go beyond just kind of the immediate need to stop somebody dying. It continues into the quality of life and what happens once somebody leaves hospital.
It's a sign that you're such a good person that you actually said, if I could turn back time 80 years, I wouldn't buy a house.
Well, I think, and invest in
What an amazing practitioner you are. So, but you can ask another question.
Yeah, just a supplementary one, really. And obviously, both as educators, and considering that the big problem that you mentioned about, social care and local authority budgets being cut so significantly, how do you attract and retain really good student social workers and qualified social workers? Have you got, I know you've probably not got a special recipe, but have you got a few ingredients that you would kind of throw into the mix?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues there. I think just to very quickly deal with the retention issue. So we'll come back to kind of recruitment of social work students, but there is a massive crisis in social work of retention. So a lot of people coming into the profession and then leaving within a couple of years. And that goes back to some of the things we've already discussed, that, that just the pressure of resources makes it kind of, very, very difficult for people to do the job that they wanted to do, to apply the values of the profession which they wanted to join. So that kind of retention issue is really massive, and it's, some people are trying to look for the kind of the magic formula to solve that, but the reality of it is, that they need to be operating in a viable environment for that, and that requires resourcing of public services. In terms of recruiting students, so we have some statutory requirements that we have to apply when we're recruiting students around sort of basic standards of literacy and numeracy, and we have an entrance test that people are asked to complete. But we also have to establish that people are kind of ready for social work training. There's a kind of statutory requirement. There's something called the Professional Capabilities Framework, which if people are interested in looking at it, they can go to the BASL website. And it's like this pretty rainbow thing, which is very stratified and sort of takes you through all the areas of knowledge and understanding and skills that people need to have throughout their career and how that's supposed to develop. And at the very inside of that rainbow is where you kind of start from. It says this is where people need to be at in order to start social work education. And I suppose that thinking about when we sort of done interviews, as we do with all applicants. Sort of the real thing that we're looking for is that people actually understand what social work is. So they've got a realistic understanding of what the roles of social workers are, of kind of what the values of the profession are, not in depth, and they don't need to know kind of the nuance of it and all that sort of thing, because that's what they're doing their training for. But you'd be surprised at how many people apply for social work and haven't actually Googled social work, I think. And so that's kind of work around understanding what the profession is. We do look for a level of experience from people, not as social work, but working in kind of a responsible role with vulnerable people. So as a classroom assistant, or in social care settings, or youth centres, or things like that. It doesn't have to be paid work, it can be volunteering. But actually that all leads to kind of an understanding of their commitment to the profession, that actually it's something they've tried out a little bit, they've got an understanding what it is. And the reality of working in caring professions, including social work, is that you are going to be in very difficult, stressful situations, and dealing with situations and with people that really challenge. And so that's that kind of inner resilience is something that's really important. And obviously we looked at how we can support that and how services should be supporting their workers as well. But people need to have that understanding of that as they prepare to sort of join the training. I don't know if you want to sort of add to that, Cherie.
Oh, I would agree, Ed. I think, having some kind of preparedness for the emotional demands of social work practice. This is a relationship, ostensibly, that you're having with people, very vulnerable people, often very distressed people. Being aware of the kind of cost of that personally, given the kind of social structure that we're in terms of organisation and context in which provision of services applied. So you do need to kind of be minded of that and invest in that. And just to add on to Ed's point earlier about retention, I know that from my kind of practice experience, lots of frustration around, particularly in children and family context, around the kind of weighting, I guess, of kind of bureaucratic or administrative tasks versus actual direct practice time has kind of been an issue of contention, one which Baz has been kind of looking at for quite some time, really wanting to kind of refocus practice with a greater emphasis in having the space for practitioners to engage in those relationships as much as the administrative responsibilities that they have to kind of fulfill.
We've just been tweeting out the links to becoming a social worker and things like that from Basil, so thank you very much, Ed. And Mark Trowin just tweeted to say, love to hear discussions taking place, lots of joint working and shared commitments between mental health nurses and social workers. Nice. Yeah. Is there any more questions, Dave, or do you want to move on?
I would say move on, but I've also been looking for that rainbow that you talked about before, and I'll be tweeting out links and pictures to that as well, Ed.
Fantastic. Thank you, David.
I would also kind of suggest that people have a look at Social Work England's website to look at the kind of professional standards there, and Baswood's Code of Ethics.
Yeah, okay. I was looking at some of the questions coming in now, but we're going to take a break and then come back to them. So one of the things we were also talking about was kind of what it takes to be a student, what it takes to be trained. But I guess, is there anything in particular that's going on in mental health, social work education at the moment that's particularly sort of driving things forward or changing, responding to the real challenges that we're facing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so mental health social work is one area of the profession where they've particularly identified a problem with retention or even recruitment of social workers. And so the program we work on with our colleagues at Think Ahead is kind of a direct response to that. It's a government-funded program, social work education and training is predominantly delivered through undergraduate and postgraduate routes within universities. So at Middlesex, we have an undergraduate social work program and a fast track MA program, and then we also have an apprenticeship program. But then there are some other routes into social work training. So Frontline is a funded children and families training route, and Step Up is another one. We have a Step Up program at Middlesex University as well. And the Think Ahead program is one which looks specifically at mental health, also so recruiting and training people to be social workers in mental health settings. I think what we're very clear on, though, is that there isn't such a profession as mental health social work. Social work is a generic profession. So we have social workers that work in mental health settings, and that's I know it sounds like semantics, but that's importantly different from being a mental health social worker, because it is that genericism which is really, really important, that knowledge across all those areas. And I've worked with the Step Up program and also working with the Think Ahead program now, and so people are naturally more inclined to work in a certain area of the service that they're specifically training for. But we really have to make it clear to them, if you're working in a mental health service, the people you're working with will have children, some of them, or maybe working in professions where they work with children, so you need to have that knowledge base. And if you're working in children and family service, well, those children have parents, and some of those parents will have substance use needs or physical support needs or mental health needs. And so, we spoke right at the top of this conversation about those two pathways, but as Cherie said later on, that is, although kind of the bureaucracy of the way services operate do sort of force those two pathways a bit, actually it's also slightly kind of an illusion as well, because the reality of it is we don't, we're all working with families, we're all working with children, and we're all working with adults. But I think kind of within, having said all that, I think that the lens that we're applying around mental health, particularly in terms of social work programs, is really focusing around things like the social determinants and looking at social interventions. And we, in our program where we look at mental health, we're focusing in particular around 3 types of social interventions. So that's motivational interviewing, systemic family interventions, and connecting people. And kind of offering skills training around those particular interventions, but also introducing people to kind of the wider concept around social interventions. We have a strong focus around relationship-based practice, and we kind of introduce people to a broader awareness of those types of social interventions. So we kind of taken on board those reports and those concerns around that, the underuse of social work as a profession in mental health services, and actually looking where how can we most usefully bolster that, what's going to be of most value to patients and mental health services, that social work can bring. And I think there's that kind of that focus around those elements is really important. We also recognise that it's Rome wasn't built in a day. I think mental health services are very, very entrenched. I think the shadow of the Mental Health Act still looms probably too much over mental health services, and I'm sure there'll be people who argue that it kind of hasn't really changed much in the last 500 years fundamentally. At its heart, it's still, if we can't deal with the way people behave, we'll lock them up. That sort of, we're working around that, but that's still right at the centre of how we deal with mental health in this country.
I think the big issue as well, when you look at that, is it's not just that people are being randomly detained. It's not just the behaviour, is it? It's the fact that demographically you can see certain populations have a great deal higher likelihood of being detained, and that's what makes makes me think it's not a biomedical issue we're looking at here. We're looking at something that's quite social as well. Cherie, did you want to add to that? Because I can see we've actually been going 40 minutes. We're going to have to start wrapping up soon.
Yeah, I was just thinking, leading on from your point, Nicky, about particular populations, and I guess that's why, that's what social work brings to practice, is that awareness, that discussion around the inequities that might be kind of underpinning some of those processes, and how we can start to challenge that in everyday practice. So being part of that broader discussion.
And we've been talking a bit about specialties and how important it is to keep that kind of what's special about specialty almost separate as well. But how can we work better together? So if we usually have people from sort of nursing and health backgrounds watching this and listening to this. So what could we do specifically to work better together, do you think?
I mean, I think kind of a dialogue between professionals is really important. Unfortunately, I think a lot of it is left to kind of individuals. The systemic kind of scaffolding around that discussion is pretty poor, generally speaking, and it seems to be left to professionals to organise themselves around that. We've been involved in Middlesex in a very large teaching partnership with a number of local authorities. And that's been really useful in terms of getting together groups of professionals and sort of building kind of communities of practice within social work. And I think to kind of replicate that and develop it within mental health settings would have real value. But also recognising that in some ways we're still trying to insert these things within the cracks that there are that are very narrow in terms of how we can operate in mental health services. And so sort of being allies to each other around that, and where we see that people are trying to innovate and, try something new or try different approaches, that we're actually really supportive of that and take an interest and, try to sort of back people on it. And a recognition that sometimes, we're not going to be able to apply models kind of universally and sort of in a very pure way. We have to kind of mix and match a little bit and find where we can apply elements of things and build a kind of some momentum behind that process. And like I say, and I mentioned it earlier, but I think also maybe for social workers to realise that it is a myth that they're the ones that are interested in these things. And actually that's, I know a lot of my colleagues in mental health probably know a lot more about some of the social interventions than I do, and are more aware of them. And actually it's about not having the opportunity to apply them so much in the same way that social workers are struggling. So I think, trying to build that kind of bottom-up approach to changing services is really challenging, but I think that's probably the way to do it.
I think it's also being able to have sufficient kind of communication and respectful communication around differing perspectives, and because actually all provision has its place and has its use, and as you kind of said, there's all sorts of kind of knowledge and skills that we share, and fundamentally for me it's about what works for the service user. So whether or not I think the medical model is the right model is kind of a bit inconsequential if it's meaningful for them and actually it's helpful for them. So I guess it's about us coming together, and kind of sharing those bodies of knowledge and expertise in a kind of respectful way, and trying to understand different perspectives when they're present, particularly if it's tense.
When is it not?
Nicky.
Absolutely. We've got just a couple of questions I can see here. Someone talking about becoming an AMP. Is there any way that you can advise on that? Another person asking.
I'd say most. So you need to be two years qualified in your profession to become an AMP, and if you work in a mental health trust, your employer will want you to be an AMP because there's a shortage of them and they really want people. But they're also short on its funding to pay for people to go and do the training. So I would say, speak to your employer really, not only because you want them to pay for it and to give you the time of work, and typically it's a 3-month training program with a placement, but also you can't actually, just being qualified as an AMP doesn't mean you can be an AMP. You need somebody to let you practice, kind of give you a warrant to practice in that area. So it's kind of no good being an AMP unless your employer is then going to let you do the role in practice.
Thank you very much. And we've got some just comments from Ben Glass finishing up, talking about this sort of, basically the same sorts of things you are about the state of social care in the country, and saying having fully funded, democratically accountable social care system is the way forward. I think anyone would disagree with that. Certainly, I think, that'd be nice. But we're getting there. It's a slow process. But I think one of the things that COVID has really done is shown us where the real problems are. And then that is not something that can be hidden at all anymore. So we're coming to final thoughts now. So I'll come to Dave first and see if there's anything that he wanted to sort of sign off with, and then back to you both, Cherie and Ed.
Yeah, I suppose a quick thought from me is I have came across social workers quite often in my past life as a health visitor. And I suppose one of the things I always try to impress upon people is, that bit about where people might think they're some kind of enforcers or, punishers. Actually, they can be really supportive enablers and help with really, really difficult circumstances. And I suppose that bit about, as in with lots of things related to public health, for example, if we can encourage people to get help, support and advice at earlier stages, then the interventions that are needed aren't as sort of significant. And I suppose, obviously in terms of funding, one of the problems that we have is, as funding does get tighter and there's more and more cuts, there's a real kind of dissuasion from people being able to access that timely support and advice and information. And I think it's important to remember with that it's not the social worker's fault that therefore they can't provide all that really good early support and advice. It's a very much a systemic governmental problem that, really kind, good professionals are put in really difficult circumstances. And I think one of the final thoughts for me would be is that mental health nurses are in exactly the same boat as social workers in that regard and respect. And that's certainly one of the reasons why both professions really do get my admiration for the amazing work that they've done. So, any social workers that are listening to MHTV for the first time tonight, just to say a big thank you for the work that you're doing, not just from myself, but Unite, my organisation, who absolutely value it. So my final thoughts, Nicky, have you got some final thoughts to share?
Not yet. Cherie, anything from you?
No, nothing else from me.
Okay, Ed?
I think it's we've touched on really interesting discussions here, and hopefully we'll continue these on social media and with each other as well. I slightly concerned we may have focused on some very significant negatives and problems in the social care system and in the mental health services, but I would also say maybe they were happier times, but I really enjoyed my time working in mental health services and in learning disability services. It was always challenging and difficult, but also I love the team I was working in. I love the patients I was working with. I found, even though we weren't always able to achieve our aims, I liked the fact that we had those aims and those ambitions. And so, I really would, encourage people to consider a career in mental health social work or social work in a mental health setting, or social work full stop if people are interested in it, and to look at social working website, look at the BASDA website, get a feel for what the profession involves, because for all that we've kind of indicated that it's a problematic environment we're working in, that's not to say I think the professions are problematic at all.
Absolutely. I think if this is the type of work you want to do, then you will love it, and you should go for it. don't ever listen to anybody else saying yes or no about it. But I think the other thing is to know what you're getting yourself into. And, because we don't want you to turn up at an interview and not really know what it means to be a social worker or a mental health nurse or anything like that. So we tweeted out a lot of the resources that have been mentioned by Cherie and Ed tonight, following the MHTV hashtag. So if you do want to add anything to those or have any more questions, we'll certainly circle back over the next day or so and check all those sort of social media timelines and see if there's anything we can do to be supportive or to help you with anything. But thank you very much, everybody, for your time tonight and for joining in with us. We've really appreciated it. And it just remains for us to say good night. Good night, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night.